IH Manchester. So your 15 minutes starts now. Good luck, Murray.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. Good morning from sunny Manchester. Welcome to this session on improving learner spelling. To begin with, to set the scene, I'm going to show you a few examples of errors that I found in my learners' written work. So these are very common mistakes that I see again and again. Perhaps some of them will look familiar to you, or I'm sure you can add many of your own examples as well. I find it's rare to mark written work without finding at least one spelling mistake. So English spelling is clearly something that learners struggle with, and it causes them a lot of problems. The three questions that I'm going to look at today is number one, why is spelling important? Why is English spelling so difficult? And the final one, how can we help our learners? Just to point out, this is a general talk about improving spelling, so helping learners in general. I'm not talking specifically about dyslexia, but some of the points mentioned will no doubt be useful for learners that might have those issues as well. So first of all, why is spelling important? It seems a little bit strange maybe nowadays to focus on this kind of accuracy area of language. We tend to focus more on speaking, we think about communication, but I think that spelling is something that's a vital part of teaching and learning a language. It's something that is really important for conveying a written message. So if students want to successfully convey a written message, then spelling plays a big part in that. If there are mistakes, that can have a negative impact on the reader, perhaps causing comprehension issues or making a text very difficult to understand. Also, if we think about the reasons why our learners are studying English, perhaps to take an exam, for future academic study in English or for work purposes, then again, accurate written communication is an important area for all of those things. And it's something that can really affect their progress and their success in those areas as well. However, it's not just about writing. We tend to associate spelling with writing, but it's also, of course, very important for developing reading skills, something that perhaps learners don't always think about. If they have difficulty in recognizing the written form of words, this can cause them problems with understanding a text. It means that they can't correctly identify the words and their meanings. They might get confused about what they are reading. A lot of words in English, perhaps there's just one letter that separates the spelling of two words, or the same letters in a different order. So, they might think they're reading about something completely different if they don't know the correct spelling. It's also something which, of course, means that they will need more time to understand and to process written text if they are struggling with the spelling. So why is English spelling so difficult? I think it's important as teachers that we look at the root of the problem, that we think about what causes these issues so we know how to help our learners with them. English spelling is known for being complicated, chaotic, and rightly so, I think. A number of reasons. There are 44 different sounds, but only 26 written letters. No consistent sound-letter correspondence. It's very, very irregular, and whilst there are some patterns, it might seem like there are no rules when we initially look at it. And of course, many silent letters, which students will cite as issues for reasons why spelling is difficult. A few examples of these then, maybe one sound is written in a number of different ways. So the sound can be represented with different vowels. Perhaps one particular letter corresponds to a number of different sounds. Groups of letters might be pronounced in different ways. A common example that causes problems is the OUGH with all its different pronunciations. And then, of course, there are words that might have the same spelling, different pronunciation, and vice versa. So all of this can make learning English spelling seem an impossible task for learners. Perhaps it's something that they give up on before they've even started, or they don't know where to begin. There's often little attention paid to it in materials and course books, so they perhaps lack the study skills they need to deal with this issue. There's also perhaps the problem of L1 interference. This might be pronunciation issues, so perhaps in certain languages where learners are unable to distinguish the sounds, so they don't know how to find the corresponding letter. It might be that there are very similar words in their L1, but with slightly different spelling, or perhaps the transfer of the L1 spelling system. For example, in Arabic, often short vowel sounds are not written down. So a lot of Arabic-speaking learners might just focus on consonants when they're writing and not think about the vowels. So if we bear all of this in mind, if we acknowledge that spelling is something that's really important, and it's also something that's difficult, then what can we do as teachers to help our learners, both in the classroom and outside the classroom, to develop ongoing study skills? First of all, I think something we need to do is to raise awareness of the importance. We need to let students know that this is something important to focus on. It's something that can have a positive impact on their learning. So, for example, with the reading skills, that's a connection that learners don't often make. So we need to let them know that it is worth focusing on, it is worth spending time on. We need to integrate spelling consistently into our lessons. So it's not just something that we reference in a writing lesson or if we're correcting written work, but it's an ongoing thing that we focus on. As teachers, we can also be empathetic. We can acknowledge the difficulties, acknowledge the challenge. We as teachers, we have all had to learn to spell in English ourselves, whether that's as a first language or as a second language. So we can use our own experience. We can talk about the strategies that we ourselves use and perhaps still use. It might be something that we continue to struggle with. So we can use all of that to share our own experience with our learners. We said before that it seems like there are no rules when we look at English spelling, but in fact, there are some patterns and rules that we can draw learners' attention to. These are often connected with grammatical forms, so perhaps adding ed for past tense or third person singular in present simple, or changing nouns to plurals, for example. And these are things which often are referenced in course books. So perhaps with adding ed or ing to verbs, we tell students they need to double the final consonant in certain cases. So again, there are things that we can let them know. There are always exceptions. So here in British English, these exceptions, but it's still useful to have a general rule to refer to. Other patterns might refer more to pronunciation. So for example, the magic E or split digraph, as it's also known, which is going to change the vowel sound. So changing hat to hate, for example, mat to mate, and so on. Again, exceptions to highlight, but this could be a very good way of letting learners know maybe perhaps why it's wrong, explaining the mistake to them and helping them to correct it in future. So in the classroom, we can incorporate these kind of things when we're teaching vocabulary, either teaching new items or reviewing. We can help learners to build an awareness of patterns, so they develop these skills themselves to start to think about the spelling, again, to maybe analyze their own mistakes. When we're teaching new items, I think it's important that we highlight potential issues that they might have. So perhaps silent letters that we said before, or maybe vowels that they wouldn't expect to see written in that way. One way that we can do this is to use different colors to draw attention to problem letters. So when writing on the boards, for example, we might use a different color to highlight difficult spellings, or when projecting something. So this both draws attention to the issue for learners and also lets them know it's something that they need to focus on. Perhaps these words might be something to focus more on when they are practicing their spellings. There are also a number of things that we can do to include written production in our lessons. Even if it's not a writing lesson, even in a speaking lesson, for example, there are simple things that we can do to make sure learners are thinking about the written form. They're engaging with the spelling. One very simple thing is to ask students to copy down vocabulary. It sounds like an obvious thing to say, but often we use worksheets or we use a page in a course book. So learners are not actually writing something themselves. It's of course going to be very difficult for them to memorize, to learn that spelling if they haven't actually written it for themselves. In any of these activities, we want to keep a focus on meaning as well and using the language. So something like a gap fill or maybe writing sentences with new vocabulary is a good way to connect the two. So we think about the spelling, but we're also using the language at the same time. I found dictation to be a really useful tool for doing this. It's something that perhaps has become a little bit unpopular nowadays, but I found that students respond really, really well to this, and it's a good way of simply, in a simple way, including writing in a lesson. This could be the teacher dictating, or it could be the students themselves in a running dictation kind of activity. One simple example of this is in a speaking lesson or before a discussion task, dictating the questions to students. So they have to write them down before doing the speaking task. Again, this gives them a chance to engage with the language a little bit more. So they are thinking about the written form, they're focusing on that before they then go on and speak and discuss something. In any of these activities, one thing to point out is it's really important that as teachers we actually monitor and we check what's being written down. So many times I've noticed learners make mistakes just from copying something from the board or from a textbook. So I think we need to make sure they know to check carefully as they copy something. Otherwise, we just lose the point of the activity. Another good thing we can do is including spelling games, perhaps for reviewing vocabulary this time, if we want to recycle and go back to previous vocab. So instead of just thinking about meaning, pronunciation, we also want to think about the spelling, include the written form. So perhaps the teacher could give a definition of a word and then ask learners to write it down, either maybe on a small whiteboard or by rearranging letter cards to spell the word. Points can be given to make it a little bit more competitive. But again, it includes that focus on the written form. So instead of just thinking about the pronunciation, the collocation, usage, context, etc., all of which are important, but also the spelling. Spelling tests, another way to do this, using the word test loosely here, as it's more of a review than an assessment. But again, this is something I found to be really popular with students, particularly with lower levels, to start a lesson with a few words that they need to write down, vocabulary from that week, and then they themselves can see their spelling improve and progress. I found that it really helps to build this habit of going away and practicing and looking at vocabulary, as each time learners, they want to beat their score from the day before, for example. They get quite competitive with themselves. So they're not trying to beat other students, but just to see their own progress. So outside of the classroom, of course, it's really important that learners do put time and effort in. We can only do so much within class time. Therefore, we need to make sure that they have skills, they're equipped with those strategies to think about their own spelling and how to improve. I'm sure you're familiar with this written correction code here. So it's very common for teachers to mark work, to perhaps underline a mistake, write SP, to ask students to go away. So they're engaging with the mistake and hopefully they will learn from it. This is something that I did for a long time before actually stopping and thinking, well, what do learners actually do with this? Do they know how to correct the spelling? If they've made a mistake in the first place, chances are they don't know the correct spelling. So we also need to make sure that they know how to correct, whether it's going back to their notebook, to their course book, to using a translation device if that's appropriate, or perhaps if needed that we give them guidance or we correct the mistakes for them. It's also important to focus on common errors. So it might be a rare word that they didn't know. Maybe we don't need to think too much about practicing that. But if we see the same recurring errors, such as the ones at the beginning, these are ones perhaps to practice a little bit more. It's also important that we set goals and we follow up. So if we expect learners to correct their own mistakes, then it's something we need to check that they are doing this and give them help where needed. This could be through a tutorial system, if that exists in the school. It could be through a review in class, or perhaps asking to resubmit the work with those corrections. And then, of course, there's the ongoing practice. So perhaps learners correct it once, but they need to be practicing in order to really learn and feel confident with their spelling. So this could be a dedicated spelling notebook. We have some learners here who they've brought a special notebook and they write words out again and again and again until they remember. It could be perhaps with some kind of spelling worksheet, like the one here on the screen. So the teacher gives that and in the class perhaps helps learners to write and practice. Or with Quizlet, I'm sure many of you are familiar with this site a really good way of practicing vocab, including spelling. So there are spelling activities there. So finally, just to say that as teachers, our attitude will have a huge impact on learners' attitude when it comes to spelling. So we need to give them these strategies, and we need to encourage them to be practicing and make them realize how important it is. They will need guidance from us. It's not something obvious and easy to do with help from their teachers, and they will need a lot of patience. It takes time and effort to improve. So again, we need to encourage them as they go. And as the saying goes, practice really does make perfect. So when it comes to spelling, there's no getting away from the fact that it takes lots and lots and lots. Okay, I think that's the end. My time is up there. So if anyone has any questions you would like to type, I can answer those questions in the chat.
Thank you, Marie. There was a question that came up from Helen. I don't know if you saw it just as we change over. She said, so Helen from Intuition said, do you find they can spell the words correctly in a single word spell, like a test? But when they have to use the words in free writing, they only have partial recall.
I can see that now. Yeah, I think that's one thing. It could be that if they're not thinking too much about the spelling, so if it's not a test or a spelling activity, then so perhaps they don't put so much effort into thinking about it, which is where it makes sense for them to go back and check when they are correcting their own work. But it might be that they need a little bit more guidance.
Thank you very much. There are some people discussing games. If you've got a moment, if you could go to the chat box and just discuss games, but otherwise it's time to move on to our next speaker. Thank you so much for a really great session, and also well done for staying within your time limit. That's even more appreciated. Thank you very much. If you could switch your microphone on, off, and we'll change over to Lucy.